Dear colleagues, dear students and friends, let me start by asking you a question that I often pose to my graduate students in a seminar on international political economy. In Book 12 of the Odyssey, how do the shipmates know which Ulysses to trust? So we all know the story, or we like to think we do. Ulysses and his shipmates have spent a year on the island of the goddess Circe. They're about to depart. Circe takes Ulysses aside and offers him a set of warnings about the dangers to come. The first one of these is the piercing song of the sirens. What she says is this: I will give you good instructions. Another god will make sure you remember. Remember the last bit about remembering because I want to come back to it. So Circe tells Ulysses to put wax in his sailors' ears to protect them from the siren song. And she says that he can listen if his shipmates bind him hand and foot to the mast. So bound, you can enjoy the siren song, but if you beg your men to set you free, they have to tie you down with firmer knots. As they approach, they get within earshot of the sirens, the wind dies down, they pull the sails, and they begin to row. Ulysses at that point, as predicted, yells to his shipmates to untie him. He is still their captain, and yet they don't listen to his pleas, and instead, two of his shipmates, Eurylochus and Perimedes, stand up and they tie him down with firmer knots. And so the question that I pose to my students, and to you, is how do the shipmates know? How can they be so certain? How are we as readers in no way surprised by this, and what would it take to shake our certainty? I think that much of the challenge of designing political institutions, whether they're national constitutions or international treaties, comes down to that question, which is, which self should we endorse? For that matter, as individuals, we face a similar problem when designing the mechanisms of our own self-rule. When choosing whether to have a second glass of wine at dinner, having promised not to previously, knowing that it might cost us 2 hours of sleep later that night, we face a similar challenge of deciding which self do we identify with, which self do we champion, and which self should we endorse, and therefore by what means. The sirens are the classic representation of the passions. We're all familiar with individual human passions, maybe to various degrees. These are the stuff of soap opera, right? They are things like anger, lust, jealousy, and increasingly the distracting pull of our devices, of social media on our attention that pull us away from the things that we might want to attend to in our calmer moments of sober reflection. What about political passions? How might we recognize those? Well, by analogy, they might be the actions or the gestures that aim to maximize power. Power is the currency of politics, and that do so at the cost of national welfare, at the cost of global welfare. So this might be leaders printing money ahead of an election or injecting liquidity into the economy, trying to exert downward pressure on interest rate in a way that juices the economy, but that comes at the cost of later inflation. It might be policymakers imposing distortionary tariffs on imports in a way that increases consumer prices domestically and passes on costs onto foreign producers. It might be invading a neighboring state to fulfill an imagined historical narrative in a way that costs civilian lives and increased global instability. These will all sound familiar, right? For a number of reasons, which we can try and unpack. We seem to have entered an age of political passion, an age of appetite, as opposed to reason or prudence. It's quite apt that the sirens in the Odyssey, as you may know, they did not sing of sex, right? That was a later Christian addition, a flourish of Christian piety. They sang of knowledge. And it's not knowledge of arithmetics or the periodic table. It's knowledge of past glory. Right? The sirens in the Odyssey sang a song of nostalgia. Now, when it comes to the individual breaking their vow not to have a second glass of wine at dinner, the cost borne at 3 a.m. when they wake up with a beating heart is entirely or mostly internalized by the individual. Right? They're the ones to bear that cost. That looks quite different in the case of governments because governments have audiences. Audiences made up of voters, markets, and other countries, foreign countries. So a political leader may have no intention in their heart of hearts to give in to temptation and to print money ahead of an election, impose distortionary tariffs on other countries, or invade the neighboring country, but intentions are invisible and talk is cheap. And they have no means, absent a device, of reassuring that audience that they will not give in to temptation. And those audiences are acutely aware of the existence of these temptations, and they will price them in. Right? They will act accordingly, such that the problem isn't just, or even mostly, having ceded to temptation. The problem is the existence of temptation without existing restraints. The result is that investors will invest less than they otherwise would. Why? Because they're wary of expropriation. Creditors will lend more warily because they fear that a sovereign can always repudiate their debt. And neighbors will hedge. They will invest in armament in a way that makes them more secure, but the initial country less secure, that triggers this negative spiral that we refer to as the security dilemma. Right? In a security dilemma, every action is rational, but the aggregation of those actions leads to a socially irrational outcome. The result of this comes from not malice, not irrationality, but the unenforceability of sovereigns' promises. This is the problem of credibility. It is the main puzzle, the main question that has preoccupied me over the last almost 2 decades. Right? And I think it remains the greatest challenge of international politics, which is how to make sovereigns believable when breaking sovereigns' promises is always possible by virtue of sovereignty. Again, the result is that temptation is priced in and countries see lower growth than they otherwise would, less investment, increased odds of conflict, and a higher cost of credit than they otherwise would. The word credit is pretty apt in this case. It comes from the Latin creditum, which comes from credere, which means to trust or to believe. The cost of borrowing is a reflection of the extent to which the borrower is believed. And when the borrower is king, there is no reason to believe him. And of course, here I'm thinking of late 17th century Britain, which happens to be the textbook example of this phenomenon. These are some of the textbooks in question. The Glorious Revolution of 1688 mostly turned on questions of religion, but it arguably had a greater impact on bond yields. Before 1688, when the crown was desperate for funds, and it was often desperate for funds, it would do crazy things, like raid the Tower of London and seize the bullion of merchants that was held there. Then comes revolution, and by subjecting borrowing and taxation to parliamentary consent, Parliament inadvertently solved the crown's credibility problem. And that had immediate fiscal consequences. Within a decade, the amount of borrowing by the crown increased tenfold, and the cost of long-term debt fell by half. By the start of the 18th century, Britain had the deepest, cheapest, most liquid capital market in Europe, which largely paved the way to its rise as the globe's preeminent naval power. So there's a great irony here, which is that monarchs gain the ability to do what they want, often wage war, thanks to the shackles that are meant to restrain them. That irony is a recurrent feature of these stories. And that's just because self-binding does not come naturally. It was Parliament that bound the crown, and not crown that bound itself in an enlightened realization of self-abnegation. Right? Those moments, they do occur, but they're quite rare, because we're rarely enthusiastic about restricting ourselves. We're rarely enthusiastic about having fewer options rather than more options. And yet, over time, that quite paradoxical insight, it does manifest itself in some pretty unexpected settings. So that even the most autocratic autocrats, and maybe especially the most autocratic autocrats, realize that being limited to cheap talk is quite expensive. And so they do this odd thing, which is to peg their currency, often to the US dollar. So that Cuba under Castro, Venezuela under Chavez, and even Iraq under Saddam, they all, in various ways and at various moments, pegged their currencies, their national currencies, to the American dollar, thus subjecting their monetary autonomy to the US Federal Reserve, the symbol of their ideological foe. Why? Because on some level, these dictators understood that they had too much freedom and that they would pay for it with lower prosperity. So they bound themselves to an external anchor. In all those cases, the limit on sovereignty is not some unfortunate byproduct of an otherwise good technical solution, it's the point. The stock metaphor when it comes to constitutional self-binding is that it's a case of Peter when sober tying down Peter when drunk. It's a good line, I use it a lot. And yet, I recognize that it's quite misleading. Right? First, because this is a reference to Peter the Great of Russia, who was seldom sober, often drunk, and not especially given to self-restraint. Second, because as in the case of the Glorious Revolution, self-binding is quite rare, and what we see more often is other binding. Binding of the opposition, binding of subsequent administrations. Third, because those rare constitutional moments, when they do occur, in international relations, we typically think of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, the Congress of Vienna in 1814, and our own post-war moment of 1945. These are not peaks of sober reflection. They are not dispassionate moments. They are periods of tumult. They are periods of great transition, marked by great uncertainty. And most often, they take place in the wake of collective trauma. And again, that's not a coincidence. It might be only in that state of mind that rational actors are willing to restrain their freedom as narrowly conceived as the ability to do anything in exchange for greater long-term stability. The same is true of the individual. Right? It's after the overdose, the marital rupture, the social humiliation that individuals enter for a brief period of time that window in which they are willing to go against their natural inclination, where the cost of ceding to temptation weighs heavily enough on the mind for them to design a better future for themselves. In that sense, the passions can be the energy that makes self-binding possible. I'm interested in some of the ways in which those energies are formally woven into institutions and treaties. So I've been looking at historical treaties. This is a picture of the national archives in Venice, where I often go to collect treaties because Venice happens to have a large repository of these. And I've been using these treaties to supplement a large corpus of historical treaties dating from the 17th century to the late 19th century, which have been recently digitized by, as it happens, Oxford University Press. And I've been specifically interested in this odd variation, which is that a good part of these treaties begin with an invocatio, in the name of the holy and indivisible Trinity, and they go on to bind the promises in the treaty to divine authority in the form of an oath, which is, by the way, what treaties used to be until quite late, until the late medieval period. And it turns out that if you look at which treaties tend to do this, it's those that are signed between historical foes, between signatories that face a high risk of conflict, that have a history of conflict, or that share no blood relation. This is mostly European states at a time when many of these sovereigns were cousins. And so in the cases where there is no blood relation, we see more invocation of God. Stranger still, controlling for that first pattern, the treaties that invoke God appear to lead to greater compliance, greater peace, in the decade that follows the signature. The conclusion of that paper, my favorite conclusion of any paper, God appears to be statistically significant. The challenge is what to make of this now, right? So at some point, that convenient binding device of divine authority, it naturally disappears with the secularization of international affairs sometime in the mid-19th century. And it gets replaced by public international law. The challenge of that replacement is still with us. The question is, what can we appeal to collectively that transcends us enough to hold us to our word? What is the point outside of ourselves on which we can place that lever? I'm interested in the stories that we might come up with to bind us when reason alone falls short. The post-war order that we've inherited and that some might argue we are now exiting came out of such a story. Right? It was out of the trauma of the Great Depression, out of the horrors of World War II, that countries came together, including the rising hegemonic power, the United States, and they agreed to convert that power into a set of common rules. The United States agreed to translate its power into a set of state institutions in a way that was very much favorable to the United States, but that remains quite striking. Over the decades that followed, the United States was criticized, rightly so, for selective noncompliance, for double standards, for a measure of hypocrisy. And yet, that should not take away from the singularity of that in historical terms. A hegemon that at least proposed to tie its hands, to decrease the returns of its power through a set of global institutions, right? That is not what Britain did during its hegemonic period. Britain very much projected its power rather than to translate it into these institutions. Lester B. Pearson, for whom this chair is named, long before he became Canada's Prime Minister, long before he won the Nobel Peace Prize for an institutional innovation, which was the creation of the first UN peacekeeping force. This was in the context of the Suez Crisis. Pearson was instrumental in creating these institutions. This is him presiding over one of the very first UN General Assemblies. And so he was especially active around the various UN agencies. I've made something of a career out of studying the result of these arrangements. The design of these rules, asking about their distributional effects, so who gains and who gains less from these international institutions, and trying to gauge the very plausibility of that fact, of a sovereign binding itself in a credible fashion. At this point, you might be justified in asking, if the powerful gain so much from binding themselves, then what on earth is happening? Right? The United States has turned its back on the very notion of global governance. It's undermined its own central bank independence and thus undermined the credibility of its monetary policy. It's begun imposing tariffs as a first resort on trade partners, including its allies. It's been imposing export bans on goods deemed strategic, according to a quite broad definition of strategic. It's resorted to economic sanctions, which used to be more rare, as kind of routine means of leverage against other countries in a way that is often referred to as weaponizing interdependence, and so on and so forth, and so on and so forth. All of political economy theory tells us that this should be very costly. So what are we to make of it? The first thing to note is that the costs have been lower than many observers anticipated. And there'd be a lot to say here. Much of it is summarized by this somewhat glib acronym. There is no alternative, TINA. There is currently no alternative to the US dollar as a reserve currency for the global economy. There is no alternative to US Treasury bonds as the safe asset in the global economy. There is no alternative to an international payment clearing system that does not pass through US banks. And there is no alternative for a large economy with a higher per worker rate of productivity than the United States. The result is that capital has little else where to go, especially given the coincidence of the rise of artificial intelligence, which undoubtedly has subsidized this period of recklessness. What's striking is that the phrase TINA, as you may know, is most associated with Margaret Thatcher. Right? And Thatcher used it to mean that markets had to, or governments were disciplined by markets. Right? So governments had to live within their means, and citizens, by the way, had to live within their means too, or bear the punishment of the market. 4 decades later, that logic is exactly flipped. Right? Now, instead of markets disciplining the state, they seem to be captured by it, at least as far as the hegemon is concerned. And so what we're seeing is the US, in a way, spending down its accumulated hegemonic capital, the capital that it accrued over the decades of, well, credibility thanks to this set of formal institutions. And I think this kind of muddles that nice distinction between passion and prudence. Right? The fact that both equity markets and bond markets have hardly budged in the face of all those disruptions suggests that the United States had been leaving money on the table for a long period. And we should not expect money left on the table to be left there forever. At some point, someone will come along and take it, and someone has. Although it also suggests that a market correction, if it does happen, might be quite abrupt. Right? And so a little bit like in Hemingway's line, where the question is, how did you go bankrupt? The answer might be in 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly. But beyond these contingent factors, I think there's 3 more fundamental reasons that might explain where we've ended up. The first one is faulty memory. Right? It might be that the urgency behind that initial moment of self-binding has simply been forgotten. The cost of global instability, the cost of ceding to temptation, might be too far removed in our collective memory. Right? It now feels foreign. Remember that line from Circe, I will give you good instructions, another god will make sure you remember. It's an odd line, right? Nowhere else does it recur in the Odyssey. There's no reference made to it, and we actually don't know who the god in question is. We can suppose that it's Athena, but again, it's a little bit like Chekhov's gun that's announced in Act 1 and that never fires by Act 3. And so what's that line doing? My own reading of it is that information is not enough. Right? The instructions by themselves aren't enough. What you need is a potent reminder. You need a mix of fear and resolve, and that's a kind of state of mind that decays over time. And it might be that in practice, this state of mind requires regular renewals. And so, like in marriage, maybe, we need to periodically work ourselves up and renew our vows. That's in part because circumstances change. The state of the world changes. It would have been a lot to ask of the designers of Bretton Woods in the late 1940s to imagine that a few decades later, China, a formerly closed socialist economy prone to widespread famine, would embark on the greatest export-driven period of industrialized growth in human history in a way that decimated a number of established industries in industrial democracies. The term of art to describe this phenomenon, this unknowability, is to say that the agreement is incomplete. Right? Every agreement in the social world is, by definition, an incomplete contract. Why? Because the agreement cannot predict all the states of the world to come. That's why the rules are never absolute. They can't be. Right? Designers of international agreements, but also of national institutions, wouldn't allow it. Right? And I think this goes to the second explanation for what we've been witnessing, which is that the rules themselves may have fallen short. And here, you'll need to bear with me for a moment while I drag you into the weeds. The weeds is where the devil lies and the action happens, especially when it comes to trade rules. So most of my research, it might not be obvious from what I've said thus far, has looked to one particular institution, which is the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and its predecessor, the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, part of the Bretton Woods institutions signed in 1947. What drew me to this specific institution is that the WTO, maybe more than any other institution, has been the embodiment of the hope for international rules, and thus of the disappointment that has followed. As a result, it's been kind of a record of my own disillusionment with the possibility of international rules, and something that I've had to reckon with. The WTO was among the first institutions in the 1990s to see this shift to legalization and even judicialization of international relations, together with the creation of International Criminal Court. This is also when the Kyoto Protocol was adopted in the climate space, and where we saw the empowerment of the European Court of Human Rights. This was a period, the 1990s, of technocratic exuberance, right? And I use the term advisedly. As a result, the WTO served as kind of a canary in the coal mine of global governance, right? For the ambitions of global rules. And if you've been following the news, it may not surprise you that the canary is unwell. Right? The WTO was arguably the first multilateral institution to see pushback, backlash, sabotage by the very country that was most instrumental in bringing it about. In 2016, the United States started blocking reappointments of judges, appellate body members, to the appellate body, which is the Supreme Court, as it were, of the WTO. This happened under President Obama, the constitutional legal scholar, which is to say how deep this suspicion of global rules lies in the United States. I think it's falsely reassuring to believe that this backlash that we're witnessing is the making of one despot accidentally elected to the White House. Right? It is not about one leader, it's a structural fact. It's about temptation. In the case of global trade, we know exactly who the sirens are. They have names and mailing addresses. They are things like the dairy industry in my province of Quebec in Canada, like the sugar industry in the United States, like the steel industry, aerospace, the car industry, auto industry, just about anywhere else. Legislators are said to be captured by these industries, which are import-competing interest groups. And so even in the best of times, policymakers have a very hard time resisting calls for protection on the part of these industries. My favorite line by a politician is by this guy, Jean-Claude Juncker, who is the former president of the European Commission, and who once said, look, we all know what the right thing to do is, we just don't know how to get reelected once we've done it. Right? If there's truth to that, and I think there is, this goes some way to, again, muddling that nice distinction between passion and prudence. The inability of political leaders to do the right thing stems from the design of our electoral institutions, which give a megaphone to powerful interest groups, which tend to be geographically concentrated, and elevates their voice above that of voters. The purpose of trade agreements is to allow legislators, policymakers, to turn to these interest groups and say, look, I'm on your side, big dairy, big corn, big steel. I wish I could help you, but my hands are tied. And there's that irony again, right? So weakness is strength. The fact of having their hands tied is what allows these policymakers to have greater bargaining power vis-a-vis these powerful lobby groups. Global rules recognize the potency of the passions in another way. They recognize that even after binding, even after having adopted these institutions, policymakers might be forced to give in to these calls for protection in the face of hard times. That's why all global agreements contain some measure of flexibility, some type of escape clause, some wiggle room. This was the topic of my first book, Making and Bending International Rules, where I looked at everything from Talmudic rules to human rights legislation and the trade regime itself. And what I was interested in is how these various rules seek an optimal level of imperfection. The question in the book was, how do you design exceptions that can be used when absolutely necessary, but that won't be abused absent such necessity? And that question, it turns out, cuts at the core of that paradox of sovereignty that I've alluded to, which is, can the sovereign actually bind itself? That question is especially salient in the most powerful exception at the core of the trade regime, which is the national security exception. So countries are allowed to impose otherwise illegal trade measures, trade barriers, if they can claim that their national security is at stake. This is the exception that the United States has been leaning on in justifying its otherwise extra-legal trade barriers. The claim it's making is we need to impose these tariffs on the aluminum industry to protect our national security. The still ongoing debate in the trade regime is about whether appeals to national security by states are justiciable. It's an ugly word, but what it means is whether an institution like the WTO has the authority, has the standing to rule on whether the national security exception applies. In other words, whether they can say what constitutes a country's national security or not. The WTO itself has ruled quite recently that it can. The United States has held from the very get-go that it cannot, and it has disregarded that ruling. In so doing, the United States has arguably proven or given credence to a very chilling line by a very chilling individual, Carl Schmitt. And the line is from 1922, and it runs, "The sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception." The idea is that sovereignty is recognized not by doing whatever you want, not by even dictating the rules, but by deciding on when the rules cease to apply. I should say that Carl Schmitt wrote this in 1922, a decade later joined the Nazi Party and became one of the chief legal apologists of the Nazi regime. And yet, he may be the most potent critic of liberalism. Even if we recognize that there is truth to Schmitt's claim about sovereignty, and I think there is, that does leave the possibility of the sovereign being constrained from within. And that is actually happening in the current case, in the case of the United States. There is a case before the US Supreme Court presently. Oral arguments began last Wednesday, so it's very much ongoing, that is examining the question of whether the president wrongfully invoked emergency powers to justify the trade barriers on the rest of the world. I co-signed an amicus brief, a brief as a friend of the court that was received last week, arguing that the United States were wrong in invoking the national security exception because there exist other more conventional flexibility provisions. I have few illusions about the current composition of the US Supreme Court, and yet I think that this may be a case where the court may actually restrain the current administration. I would actually be willing to put money on it. And yet the fact remains that at the international level, insofar as exceptions are necessary, and they are, and insofar as the sovereign is he who decides on the state of exception, which may be the case, it ultimately means that everything rests on informal coordination, on norms, on taboos, on a kind of accumulation of state practice, right? And that might seem very disheartening, but the remarkable thing is that for a very long time this held, right? The taboo of the national security exception in the case of the trade regime held for over 60 years. No one touched it, not because it was too difficult to use, but because it was too easy. And there was an understanding that if anyone pressed that button, it would open the breach wide. And it would set a precedent that would effectively dissolve the meaning of the rules. And so no one did, right? Until someone did. A common postmortem of the trade regime among WTO wonks is that the invocation of the national security exception was precipitated by a series of judicial rulings that made it progressively more difficult to use the existing flexibility provisions. These get referred to as the holy trinity of trade remedies: anti-dumping, countervailing, and safeguards. I warned you about the weeds. And I cheered those decisions as victories of law over politics. I thought of them as victories of reason. In retrospect, that might have been, well, hubristic. The result was an agreement that arguably no longer reflected its political antecedents, which is a phrase from the British historian E.H. Carr in his book, The 20 Years' Crisis, which happens to be one of my favorite books. That reading that the United States were, in a way, pushed towards using the national security exception is quite a generous reading for the rule breakers. But I do think that there's some truth to it. Right? The initially agreed on forms of flexibility were increasingly constrained, and the US resolved to go against the spirit of the agreement, go against the vibes. There are solutions to this problem. The solutions are reform. The solutions are better rules. The insight is that better, in this case, does not mean more perfect. It means more optimally imperfect. And that, even when attained, is a pretty fragile equilibrium. Again, because ultimately it's an equilibrium that rests on, well, on the spirit of the agreement more than the letter of the law. Here's a third and final account of our age of appetite, and it might be the most disquieting. The passage of time by itself can be a bad reason to go against one's past commitments if it's just a process of forgetting. But time also offers legitimate grounds for rejecting earlier commitments. Experience reshapes our preferences. And sometimes that shift is warranted. Sometimes it's democratically ratified. The story here would be that a concern with technocratic efficiency has given way to an appetite for what we might call a romantic impulse. And it might be that the technocrats have themselves to blame. Right? Theirs was a very particular definition of reason, largely inscribed in economic theory. I should say it's my own definition of reason as well. It's a view of reason that is especially preoccupied with increasing the size of the pie, and as a result kind of overlooks the question of who gets what slice. It's also a definition of reason that, again in economic terms, is more focused on consumption than on production. It's a view that looks at production as just the kind of tedious thing that you need to do in order to maximize consumption. I should say that consumption in this reading is a very capacious term. It stands for leisure, it stands for hanging out with your family, and yet it's a view that's quite bad at accounting for how production itself can have inherent value, how individuals especially can view production as valuable in itself. Whatever the cause, there are signs that what we are seeing is a real shift in preferences. I said that the costs of the US's recklessness were lower than expected, but they are real. Right? The dollar has dropped, prices have continued to rise, and the cost of debt especially has increased. And what's interesting is that these costs happen to be disproportionately concentrated on the segment of the population that is the electoral base of the current administration. And here what I find most striking is the apparent willingness of that electoral base to absorb those costs. Right? So here are two facts. The first map is exposure to import tariffs on the part of the United States, meaning that the darker areas are those that rely more heavily on imported goods in their basket of consumption. And in industries situated in these areas, these are industries that rely more heavily on imported inputs. These are also areas that voted heavily for the administration. The second map is exposure to retaliatory tariffs on the part of Europe and China and other countries. And again, what we see is a similar concentration on the electoral base of the current administration, and this is by design, right? Both Beijing and Brussels know where the voters of the administration are. We also know that both of these facts have done little to change the political loyalties of the people living in these areas. So that, for instance, farmers who were most directly affected by the first round of tariffs then voted in the second term in record numbers for the president. Political entrepreneurs are recognized by their ability to reshape people's aspirations, to reshape people's definition of the good life. And I think that's what this current wave of populist leaders is doing. They're not just offering some seductive policies, they're changing the underlying preferences. They're elevating sovereignty over efficiency, belonging over mobility, and protection over openness. Many citizens, there and here, seem to increasingly identify with a self, with a leader, that does not stand for prudence as we previously conceived of it. And I think that should give us pause. The possibility of individual preferences changing is something that political economists used to care about, but no longer do. So that John Stuart Mill, for instance, cared about this a lot, thought about this a lot, worried about it a lot. But someone like Stanley Jevons, who was a British economist associated with the marginal turn, who was his contemporary, but 30 years younger, explicitly washed his hands of it and left it to philosophy. I'm interested in reviving those earlier questions and looking at them through the tools of political economy. Which brings us back to my initial question. How do the shipmates know which Ulysses to trust? I have asked this question to hundreds of people, political scientists, economists, but also classicists, philosophers, not to mention about 15 cohorts of very smart graduate students. The answers vary quite a bit, but they tend to fall into two camps. The first is something that might be called an objective list approach. According to this, the shipmates know, they realize that untying Ulysses means crashing against the rocks. And so they're choosing between life and death, and they choose life. It's a simple account, and it's quite plausible. I think it's incomplete, because the problem is that it requires the shipmates to choose on their own. Right? They are disobeying orders, and they're basing it on what they know for themselves. And it kind of asks a lot of the shipmates, especially that we know that they have trusted, delegated power to their captain, to Ulysses, in the past, and they will keep trusting Ulysses with their life subsequently, in many cases at the cost of their lives, if you've read the book, spoiler alert. The second camp argues that we can infer something from the asymmetry between the two selves. Right? Ulysses 1 is able to look forward to Ulysses 2 in a way that Ulysses 2 cannot look back on Ulysses 1. So that only Ulysses 2 is able to see at once the cold state of planning and the hot state of temptation and weigh them. Whereas Ulysses 2 is kind of closed in his blinkered state of mind. And thus, the test is the ability to see the two selves and the ability to bind yourself. Right? We would have a hard time imagining Ulysses 2 yelling to his shipmates to untie him and adding, "And next time I tell you to tie me down, don't listen to me at all." Right? Because it presumes an awareness that is denied to Ulysses 2 by definition. Now, let me offer a similar story with a similar structure, but where time plays a bigger role. I'm often approached by graduating students with the following plan. This is especially when I used to teach in North America, where students would have a lot of student debt. And these students would say to me, my idea is to enter a lucrative career for, say, 5 years, and then, at the end of those 5 years, having paid off my student debt, having earned enough for a down payment on a house, I will finally start doing what I actually want to do with my life, which is, make documentary films. What invariably happens after those 5 years, if I hear back from them, is that they would have shifted preferences, right? The pull of that initial calling no longer exerted the same force. Their preferences, the criteria by which they judged of the good life, had changed. They now wanted to make partner of the firm. Right? And so, as in my role as a mentor, should I then tell them, you need to honor your first commitment, right? Stop being a banker, stop being a lawyer, and go make a documentary film? I'm not so sure. Right? What I do tell them at T0, when they announce the plan, is, look, people who make this kind of commitment often find that their preferences change. You might find that your preferences change as well. Having said this, I think I've absolved myself of my mentoring obligations. The question is, what should they do with that information? Should they take precautions against that preferences change? Should they bind themselves to their initial intent? Or should they allow themselves to become someone they're not? Again, this question is one that political economists tend to avoid. we're just biased towards Ulysses 1. We're quite moralistic in this respect. Right? We take for granted that reason ought to dominate passion. And yet, I think we have to reckon with the fact that Ulysses 2 sometimes has the stronger claim, for reasons that are both good and less good. The episode of the Sirens has had tremendous influence over my thinking over the past couple of decades. But I've also come to doubt that passion and reason can be cleanly delineated. I think we need to keep asking how the shipmates know which Ulysses to trust, because I think the answer is actually far from obvious. I've tried to offer some of the reasons why. Credible commitments, those rare constitutional moments, they rarely arise from dispassion. Because it takes a kind of passion to summon the will to self-bind, which isn't to say that we should wish for collective trauma any more than we should wish for the weekend bender or the overdose, but we should remember that reason rarely moves us by reason alone. When the French Constitutional Assembly of 1789, during the French Revolution, bound itself by limiting its re-election possibilities, one observer described it as being ivre de désintéressement, drunk on disinterestedness. Is that passion or prudence? It also turns out that as opposed to the clean separation between Ulysses 1 and Ulysses 2, the passion itself in practice often can turn to politics to bind the sober self. This past summer, in my province of Quebec, the dairy industry succeeded in passing legislation in federal parliament that made it illegal to bind itself. So they bound themselves against self-binding. The legislation says that Canada cannot offer any concessions on dairy. The current dairy quota is of 267%, and it cannot do this by law. This is akin to the sirens swimming over to the ship and stealing all the rope. Right? So this too, I think, muddles that clean distinction between sober and passionate. I've also mentioned the technocratic exuberance of the 1990s, to which I think I've indirectly contributed. Over time, we may have assumed that the appeal of reason was self-evident, that we didn't need another God to make sure we remember, that the information alone would suffice. Finally, we have to recognize that circumstances change, the state of the world changes, and so do people. And if there are legitimate reasons for going back on our commitments, then it also means that there are less legitimate reasons for doing the same, and then the task is to tell the two apart. If we want institutions that last, we have to recognize the continued pull of those passions. And I think that requires an exercise of sympathy, in the old Scottish Enlightenment sense of the word, as this ability to imagine ourselves, to inhabit the other self, or the other citizen. Right? Sympathy is how we keep Ulysses 1 alive in political systems where the song of the sirens is always being heard. So the task is not so much to engineer passion out of politics as if it were some pathology. The task is to harness those passions on behalf of better reasons, through a study of history, through innovative rules, possibly through novel rituals to make and to renew our commitments. If we side with Ulysses 1, if we side with reason, we have to be willing to fight for it passionately. I thank you for your attention.